Yes. Yes, we've been very actively engaged in those conversations with DWR and with the Water Resources Control Board, State Water Resources Control Board. Um, and in the governor's executive order, he released 2 drought executive orders last month, and one of them, the second one, not only extended water conservation, but also encouraged agencies to work together to streamline permitting. And as a result of that executive order, we've been very engaged and very involved, and we have been before that anyway. I think there's a lot of opportunity not only for groundwater recharge, but as you talked about, flood relief for downstream communities, and I think that's a huge, huge benefit. We in our world we talk a lot about co-benefits, and I don't think this is a co-benefit at all. I think they go hand in hand, and it's how we've been, in California for many, many years. Is the opportunities for farmland to work with our natural systems is, I think, a huge benefit, and I'm sure Tim Johnson will be speaking later today with the Rice Commission. I'm sure he'll be talking a lot about that as well.
Just a quick question to Deputy Secretary Moffitt. So first, thank you both for your presentations, and Deputy Secretary, I really appreciated a lot of the statistics that you provided. I was trying to write down as quickly as I could as you were talking, but I want to make sure I got my facts straight. So you said that 20% more farmland has been fallowed this year as opposed to last year. Is that
due to the drought?
Due to the drought, yes.
Right.
Which resulted in 1.8 billion in farm loss. Is that
Direct farm
loss?
And that includes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
It came from our report.
It came from the report. But that also includes additional costs of pumping as well.
Right, that's right.
Got it. Okay. And then I think the most stunning is the 35% loss of surface water.
Well, total water, actually. It's about 33% loss of total water supply.
I mean, that's huge. I mean, I think that was part of the, not that I want to rehash old debates, but it was part of the debate, over the groundwater legislation was, well, if you don't have access to your surface water, where are you going to get it? Otherwise, places like the Central Valley and where I represent, specifically southern Fresno County, could have looked like a modern-day Dust Bowl. I mean, there are communities out there that could have literally just dried up there, and some are that small where, they really are a town of 4 large farms, and that's the town. And if one of those towns goes away, then the school is relocating, and then the whole thing changes. So I did have one question in particular, though, in terms of one of the facts you brought up. You had mentioned that farmers had become more efficient with water. I'm assuming that means drip irrigation or other technologies that are much more precise in how farmers are using water. Has CDFA or anybody else measured the impact to groundwater recharge with these new technologies? I hear a lot of anecdotal comments that, farmers used to flood irrigate in many ways, and a lot of that water would then help recharge the groundwater. And now that we're more precise, one of the side effects of that is we're not getting that benefit. Can either one of you talk to that?
I'm delighted that you raised that point, because there's a lot of folklore in the past about how important it is, the alleged savings that you get by going to drip irrigation in inland areas. And that savings is really false savings, because that water is already being saved as recharge to groundwater in many cases. So we do see some small reductions in sort of evaporative losses that are unproductive when you go to precision irrigation, but it's relatively small. I think there's a reasonable concern that as we move to drip irrigation for several other reasons, for improving the quality of crops and improving irrigation uniformity and crop yield, one of the downsides is that we're reducing the amount of recharge to groundwater that we need to sustain these permanent crops through drought years. So people are starting to look at how can we supplement by artificial recharge or the way we manage the irrigation districts, additional recharge to take that water that used to be recharged through the fields and recharge it through the distribution system or artificial recharge so that we maintain that groundwater basin.
Has an analysis been done on so I'm assuming that CDFA or other state programs are providing incentives to farmers to switch to drip irrigation, and some farmers are probably just doing it on their own, maybe taking subsidies, maybe not. Has a cost analysis been done in terms of what we're spending, what they're spending, and the savings that we're receiving from that?
I'm sure there has been a cost analysis. I'm
you
not
haven't- you haven't
aware
seen
of it,
that,
but one
okay.
thing I want to make a point of is in our incentive program, our state water efficiency and enhancement program, we do not discourage taking out previous flood systems, and we definitely want to encourage, and we talk with growers about the opportunities that in dry years we employ the more efficient water irrigation systems, but in wet years where we have the adequate water supply, we can revert back to old systems. So it's the concept of conjunctive use and being mindful that
Right.
we're and growers need this as well to not only flush out salts and
Right.
other things in the soil as well, but to be mindful that as we are employing these efficient irrigation systems, we're using those in the dry years, and in the wet years, we're going back to systems that have been employed for many years.
And so is that sort of is that the standard practice right now? I mean,
It depends on
Okay.
each individual farming system. I think it's something that we certainly don't discourage in our grant process.
we don't necessarily advocate for it. We just tell you can't, you shouldn't. How does the state interact with farmers in that regard? Because what you're saying to me makes sense. But how do we manage all of that? How are we communicating?
I think one difficulty is California is a very large state, and it's very diverse in its agriculture. It's very diverse in its hydrology.
Yeah.
And the local water districts and the local farmers, I think, are the most mindful
Right.
of what they really need to do. And
Right.
that has really shown up how in pretty effective responses locally to, and again, to the point of, can we collect any wetness that comes this year? This is on everybody's mind. I think every farmer, every urban user, every water manager at the local, state, federal level, they're all thinking the same thing. So
Sure.
we'll
Okay,
catch
thank
as
you.
much as we can, I'm sure.
Thank you.
This question is to both of you. So when we were having the policy discussion on the groundwater management legislation last year, one of the things that I raised was, is there an ability to count groundwater recharge as a beneficial use? And at the time, the answer was no, we have to get the policy right on the groundwater management first, and that's not settled yet before we address, how do you quantify what's beneficial use and who gets credit and who gets access to that first and who has it last and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that we're at any point closer to being able to start looking at counting groundwater or groundwater recharge as beneficial use?
My understanding is that the concern at the State Water Resources Control Board level, at the legal level, is trying to maintain the integrity of the surface water rights system so that people are not sort of laundering water through groundwater so that they can avoid changes in water rights permits. That's my understanding of it. I do think, as a systems analyst for this system, that we do have to encourage people to bank groundwater, and to some degree, banking groundwater when you're not sure exactly what purpose it will be put towards in some future drought is a good thing. We're not sure who and where and what is going to need that water exactly in the coming drought, but we know someone is going to use it, and we'll be really glad to have it there. So I think we do need to move fairly aggressively in that direction.
Any other questions of either panelist?
Again, I'd like to thank both of you for your presentations. I guess one question, and I know you touched on it briefly when we talked about the Healthy Soils Initiative, and often when we talk about drought, we're talking about water supply, but it's not just water. Water washes away salts and so forth. What's the impact of the drought on soil conditions, particularly? I mean, we've heard about as we're moving toward not only groundwater recharge, but as we're getting, quote, more efficient, that's a good thing with the water, but we're also then impacting the quality of the soil and its ability to grow crops. And how is I guess CDFA looking at that, and how are we trying to address that?
So the direct question, what is the impact on drought and soil conditions? That's a very good question. I don't have an answer for that. I'd say certainly land fallowing does not improve soil conditions in the state. But beyond that, I don't have much more of an answer. For healthy soils, it's really looking at management practices, on-farm management practices to increase soil organic matter. And by doing that and in that way, by increasing soil organic matter, you can actually hold more water in the soil. But of course, first you have to have water available to hold into the soil.
Okay, but obviously the soil itself, obviously water is a very important component to that. But if the soil is too much salt or other things and you can't wash it out, you're not going to be able to grow things very well either. And so I think it'd be good to look at that.
I think there will be a concern in some areas in the San Joaquin Valley in particular that there might have been enough water to grow some of the crops, but not enough water that you would add a little bit more water to flush some of the salts out. I imagine that some of the farmers have been making those trade-offs, thinking about what's the impact on next year's future year productions if I can't flush the salts out this year.
So obviously that's going to have an impact on our agricultural productivity over time and sort of a cumulative effect. And then I guess the other thing I know that we touched on groundwater and I think in terms of looking at our water use, often we talk about, okay, do you take the water from the river or from wherever, and then we certainly in Northern California, the water we don't use, hopefully some of it will evaporate, which then isn't very usable. Some of it will hopefully become groundwater recharge. Some of it actually flows down the river and gets reused again. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that when we're looking at this, when we try to figure out how to count how we're using the water, that we take account of the fact that at certain places that you're not losing the water. We need to be very accurate in how we count how we use the water and not simply say, well, if you used it, depending where you are, and I think it does speak to the different hydrologies and different things, but I certainly hope, and I know that there's other agencies involved as well, but when we look at that, we take account of that aspect of things in different areas. If the water is going to be able to be reused because it flows back into the river or wherever else, or groundwater, that's something we should take account of, because that would be a more accurate assessment of our water supply.
I'm delighted you raised this, because this, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, biggest weaknesses that has come up, been highlighted by this drought, is the really fairly poor level of accounting that we have as a state. We have many different state agencies, each of which maintain separate and somewhat distinct accounting systems, and some agencies even have several accounting systems within the agency. I think in the long term, for droughts and for SGMA implementation and water rights administration, as well as policy and environmental management, we need to have a far more authoritative and centralized statewide accounting system that operates across the agencies. And you might tailor a little differently, hive off of for different purposes, but we're really hindering our ability to manage and have coherent policy discussions because we lack the kind of accounting system that you point out.
Well, certainly, I think more accurate information is hopefully help drive better decision making. So,
right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Assembly member?
As you're discussing the numbers and the yields, and we're going from surface water to pumping groundwater, and you mentioned there's no need for concern. It's not like we're going off a cliff, but in reality, you can only drill so deep with groundwater where you get to a point where the water is not only non-potable for humans, but it's not good for the plants. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know of farmers that have quite literally desal systems on their pumps because the water that they're pulling up is so bad it will destroy their crops. So when we're looking at the solutions for this, and in your analysis and the data that we're collecting, what are we looking at as what is the end point? Because different basins go different depths, but there's a point where we just can't go that deep and the water's not there. And at that point, what do we do? if we're not considering groundwater recharge as a vital use, if we're not increasing our storage capacity, and we're not looking at other sources such as desal to bring water in.
Again, California is a very diverse place. And you're right, there are places where farmers are coming across these problems. And as the drought would wear on, we will see those problems increasing. I'm saying as a cautionary note that statewide, as an overall statewide sector, it's not falling off of a cliff. But locally, it might well, you know, and certainly individually, there will be instances of it. And we've already have had these instances.
But locally, when you look at the subsidence issue, when you look at, you know, Kings County, you look at the San Joaquin Valley Basin, that is the heart of our agriculture center in the state of California.
Right.
That is the spot that's being hit the most. And, you know, as a state, we'll be able to have other areas in the state that are ag use, but the climate within the San Joaquin Valley is the only climate in the world that can grow the produce that it can.
And those are the most.
And that's the spot that we're losing.
And those are the most agriculturally productive counties in the state and the country. So and even those areas have gotten through this drought surprisingly well, given the magnitude of the drought. We do need to take some measures moving forward to make sure that that can continue, that can be sustainable. And the SGMA, I think, is probably the major framework that that's going to occur in. Because every local area is going to have to do its own mass balances, make sure that it can supply as much water as it can to meet those needs, and then figure out how to divide up the water that's there so that it's put the most effective use.
The problem is that the water that's there, there's that point where you can't go deeper.
Right.
And there's a point where, and even with the cities, this comes into play, that we have cities that are surface water dependent. And we have, in these cities, provide the workforce for our agriculture areas. There's a point that groundwater is no longer an option because we can't go that deep.
That's right.
And we need to have the ability to provide the surface water, to provide the recharge where it is a vital use, because it is.
That's exactly right.
I think it's one of the most important lessons that we've learned in the drought is that every region, every community is hit differently. And, you know, I'll pick on the rice industry because Tim has a chance to speak later. But yeah, so at the 10,000 foot level, we're seeing increases in farm gate value statewide in California. But that's statewide, that's amongst all crops. And as we dig down deeper into regions and communities and specific crops, for instance, rice, there are deep impacts. And that not only has impacts on the farmers and the communities, but also the processors and the markets that have been developed. And I think that's an important thing to know. Certainly the impacts in the communities who are experiencing not only dry wells, but severely high unemployment. These impacts in each community are different and felt pretty hard in some areas. And I think that's the most important thing we need to remember and recognize.
Now, you just mentioned, loss of jobs on the production side and the processing plants and those. Is that included in your analysis for the job loss on the ag side?
No. It works mostly on the inputs to the production. Okay. But most of the downstream employment impacts are for the higher value crops, and we're seeing less impacts to the production of those crops.
I think it's important to look at the job loss on the production, because
right.
As these things, when we're measuring the job loss and we're looking at, okay, this farmer is no longer able to hire these farm workers to work here, but you're also losing the production at the other end too, because then it just shuts down a whole entire line.
So when we have the multiplier effects, when you have the 20,000 estimate, that includes the multiplier impacts.
Yeah, just conceptually, one way I've really been thinking about this is that you have groundwater, which is really a localized resource, localized regional resource, and I think Sigma recognizes that. And then you have surface water, which is more of a statewide resource, certainly allocated based on water rights, and also based on issues with the Delta. But that's more of a statewide resource. And both need help, you know, in order for us to be better prepared for the next drought. And it seems to me the solution to really both of those is how we manage stormwater, how we manage this water that we're getting, the floodwaters. I know Senator Galgiani just brought it up, like, hey, when we're getting these floodwaters, how can we better manage that water? And I think on the surface water side, if we can capture more of that runoff, we can utilize that for all the different needs statewide, whether it be farms, cities, environmental fish issues, keeping cold water temperatures in the river. So we need to do that end of it. But we can also utilize that storm water and take it to help recharge certain areas. I know people have talked about the Tulare Lake Basin as maybe a potential place to do some of that work. In different parts of the Central Valley where we can utilize that storm water we're getting in the winter months and somehow get it to places where it can be used to recharge. So, I mean, do you think that's a good characterization of where we need to go, or how would you maybe correct or add to that?
Absolutely, and I think I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know Daniel Mountjoy with Sustainable Conservation has been actively working on projects for quite some time now on this, and so he'll have some data that I think will be really interesting for you guys to hear later on. But definitely, there's I think a lot of potential.
In Southern California, the urban areas down there have been particularly interested in recharging stormwater because otherwise it gets lost out to sea and they have to manage it on the way out. So they have quite a lot of active engagement there. Well, you can go up into the Central Valley and you could argue that, well, all the big reservoirs are essentially stormwater capture too. But you're right, ultimately, our overwhelming source of water in the state is storms. Those storms, you can count them on that graph.
Right, and even
so
on
anyway, we can store them. But again, California's a very diverse place. If you go down to the Tulare Basin, you try to capture stormwater. Well, in the valley floor, they have about 5 inches of precipitation a year. So you're not going to be able to capture a lot there relative to other places.
Right, but even with the, like in the Sac Valley, northern part of the state, we have, reservoir, we have Shasta, we have Folsom, we have Oroville, but there's water that's fallen below those dams. Right. I mean, I think the estimate was somewhere, if we had, say, a Sites reservoir, we could have captured somewhere around 900,000 acre feet just in these last 2 drought years. That's a lot of water in a drought year that we could capture and utilize. And then if we can somehow, and I know there's ideas about it, how we do that, but if you could capture the water, the floodwaters maybe out of the Delta or some other place and transfer them to places that need recharge, that might be the way, because you're not going to get that precipitation in those areas to help recharge. So you need to get that from the floodwater that's happening somewhere else.
You need to get it from where it is. As an engineer, you can do a lot of things. As a policymaker, is it a good investment? Because all of these things cost, and is it worthwhile? Are the benefits you get worthwhile the investments you have to make in order to do that? We can always desalt seawater if you're willing to pay $2,000 or $3,000 an acre foot.
You mentioned earlier that 500,000 acre feet of land went fallow last year and 400,000 this year. Does that mean 400,000 in acres? Does that mean in addition to the 500,000 last year?
No. It was 400,000 acres last year were fallowed by our estimates, and 540,000 acres this year due to drought. Now there's normally there's on the order of 1 million or 1.2 million acres of land that is fallowed just normal crop rotations in California.
Thank you. Any other questions from members? Please.
I think one important factor to look at is that within California, with the aqueduct system, with our canal system, we have the ability to move water quite literally in a circle around the valley. And so when we talk about water and where it's going and what it's doing, in these analyses, are we looking at the fact that we can move water from one end of the San Joaquin Valley all the way up to Northern California, up into the Delta, all the way down the west side, and then back around? And these are things that are in place. These are systems that are being looked at. There's, legislation for cross conveyance canals. These are systems that we need to be able to move the water. But when we're doing the analysis, are we looking at, you know,
Oh,
we
yes.
spent a lot of this time talking about the problem and not enough time talking about the solution and what needs to happen because we're concentrating on the problem. So as we're doing this, and I know I'm going to be talking to you later on, what do we need to do? And I think that's the real question, is what is the actual thing that needs to happen? What is the solution?
I think the solution's going to be a portfolio of things. You're not going. It's not. People say all of the above. I don't believe in all of the above because all of the above, in a pure sense, includes a lot of things where the investment is not worthwhile. But there'll be a lot of the above. I certainly believe that. There'll be a lot of groundwater management. A tremendous amount of groundwater recharge will be here. To some degree, I think we have to realize that California is a dry place with a huge population and a huge economy, and we want to keep the fish and critters around. We're going to struggle with water. Not everyone's going to be happy. And how to share that pain is an important policy responsibility.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, we'd like to thank you both. That was very informative, and we appreciate the time you put into preparing for us and taking time to answer our questions as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. If you have any further questions, you know where I live.
Thank you. And we will go ahead and call up our second panel at this point in time. First with us, and this is on adaptive strategies to mitigate, economic impact on ag communities. We have Maria Elena Puente, Yolo County, California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation.